Hey there, Jonathan here. I wasn't going to do an intro for this video, but this video that I did with Andrew Roushdy definitely went a little deeper and more personal than I expected it to. We were going to talk about virtue and philosophy of death, and Andrew kind of turned the interview around on me and got me to talk a little bit about my own personal story and my own views. And in a way, we kind of went away from strict philosophy to talking about how it for both of us how philosophy informed our past informed our own views, and we did keep it within our own certain philosophical perspective. Me coming from a more absurdist perspective, and him coming from a more theological Christian background. I found it an interesting conversation. I had a lot of fun with this. Uh, and for the first part, when we're talking virtue, we definitely taught. I really kind of let him kind of open the ground for us with Aristotle, Plato. But as conversation went along, especially once we turned towards the idea of philosophy of death, it definitely took a more personal turn. I hope you enjoy this. It's a lot longer video than I expected. I'm debating whether or not to do little sections because I felt like the virtue discussion really flowed into, how one faces death. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you learn something, and not the greatest production quality. uh, my video is the home of poor production qualities. I'm going to try and improve that. But I do plan to continue this and try to get the videos a little better quality. So without further ado, let's get into it. There we go. Hello, I'm Jonathan Burnham. I am here with Andrew Roushdy, and he is a PhD student here at Marquette in philosophy. Are you doing theology as well, or
I'm a PhD candidate in theology with the University of Thessaloniki.
University of?
Thessaloniki in Greece.
Oh, okay, yeah, Thessaloniki. Did I say that right? Thessalonia?
Thessaloniki, yep. It used to be, it's gone by different names in the past.
Okay, okay. And today's subject, we are going to talk about um, virtue, Aristotle. We're going to focus on Aristotle, or you got other ones to bring into it?
Both Aristotle and Plato, perhaps.
Aristotle and Plato. So talk a little bit about virtue, virtue ethics, and what the concept of flourishing. And then we're going to discuss philosophy of death. And we both had that conversation where it's like, I don't want to be the deaf guy.
Right, right.
And I thought that was kind of funny because I didn't even realize someone else in the department might be associated with that. Do you have a little bit of background you could talk about in terms of your study on death?
Oh, well, it's funny. I mean, Plato says, what does it mean to study philosophy other than to study death? He says all philosophy is thanatology, meaning the study of death. And so philosophy is nothing more than the preparation for death, if one wills. That's Plato.
Yeah,
Plato
that's
thinks
Plato.
Plato thinks all of philosophy is to study how to live and by extension how to die.
How to die. Yeah, I mean, that just been my experience. We won't get too far into that, but yeah, no, with my own condition, it's like okay, facing death is like, how do I live?
Hmm.
What do I do with the time I have left?
Right.
Uh, and I think sometimes you end up in a position where it's like, let's see, oh, I'm like pushing myself off the camera here. Uh, Hopefully I don't get too close here. That work better? Yeah, that works better. Uh, then you want to pull this just a little forward. They can see it. That's fine. Um, yeah, it's like, how do you? I hate to say the term medium. We'll get to that too because um, I'm the worst sort of skeptic.
Say again,
The
sorry.
worst sort of skeptic.
The worst sort of skeptic?
The
Okay. Yeah.
absurdist.
No, please. Yeah.
the
It almost logically follows in a way.
Yeah, it's a sense of how to live life well without meaning.
Right, right. And that's why I like really enjoy Nietzsche. He's like a very intellectually honest
Yeah,
thinker in that respect.
yeah, and so most of what I know is coming from more experience. I'm learning philosophy, so I'm going to give you a chance to kind of talk about your background a little bit. I mentioned a little bit of it. Can you just give any viewers an idea?
Oh, sure. So, like Jonathan, I'm here studying philosophy at Marquette University. I'm a doctoral candidate in the philosophy program. In addition to being a doctoral candidate in theology, I have master's degrees in philosophy, theology, and church history. So this is what I do for fun. And I'm currently in training to be a chaplain in the United States Armed Forces. So death is something I certainly have to think about often, especially when giving counseling, which I do every summer. I get to practice my chaplaincy and give counseling to people who are themselves not on a philosophical level, perhaps, but on a personal and practical level, wondering about their own mortality, especially if they're about to enter a deployment or war is about to break out. So, on both a practical and an academic level, I'm unfortunately someone who is often left thinking about death.
Okay, and there we go. So we're gonna jump right into it. I'm gonna grab. This is a printout we had from my ethics class I'm in about Aristotle and virtue ethics. I might just end up using it as a reference if I need to.
Yeah.
So let's kind of get started. Let's can you give us a little bit of background? Like you mentioned Plato and Aristotle. Kind of I guess start with Plato when it comes to virtue ethics.
Oh, sure. So Plato's eudaimonianism is such that he thought.
Let me stop for a moment. Can we explain? I don't need. I can't even say it.
Eudaimonianism, yeah.
Eudaimonism.
Yeah. The understanding that being virtuous is what makes us happy, that we acquire happiness through virtue, and that virtue leads our ethical thinking.
Okay. And we'll get to happiness. I just
Mhm.
wanted to kind of, for any viewers, understand what
Right.
the term is.
Right, my bad.
Okay, no, that's fine. Because again, the whole point of this channel is I'm learning as I go as well. And like I've heard this term and I looked it up. I still don't know how to say it.
No, it's a tough term.
Okay, go ahead.
So Plato was an interesting figure in that he was certainly of a, if you will, much more of a religious, spiritual bend than his disciple Aristotle. Plato believed in reincarnation.
Yeah, you did.
He did. He believed that we keep reincarnating until we break the wheel of reincarnation. And you see elements of both Eastern and Western religion in Plato. Plato also believed in a very similar understanding of the afterlife to what the Catholic Church teaches today. Plato believes that, let me backtrack. Plato believes in a soul that is tripartite, consisting of the rational soul, the spirited, and the appetitive.
What's that last one?
Excuse me. Appetitive.
Appetitive. Okay, I think when we say appetitive, we're talking about like kind of the desires,
right?
You know,
right.
And kind of carnal side.
Right, and only the rational he thinks is good. He thinks the other two parts of the soul are actually evil, and that the rational has to subdue the evil parts of the soul. And so he thinks
the spirit's considered evil as well.
Sorry, say again.
The spirit, the soul,
the spirited and the appetitive. Yeah, every other part of the soul is an evil, and they're all sort of fighting for control. And you have to, with your will, make sure that the other two are subordinate to the rational. And if not, what are the consequences? Well, the consequences are that when you die, if you fail to accomplish this, you'll reincarnate, or even worse, you'll go to Tartarus. Right? At a certain point, when your soul becomes so corruptible, it can no longer reincarnate. It just becomes corrupted. And so Plato believed in what he called the corporealization of the soul.
Kind of like a bad computer program.
Yeah.
We're just done with it. Nothing you can do with it.
Yeah. Just throw it out. It's gone. Plato believed that if you allow the spirited and the appetitive, so if you're like emotional, or if you're very hedonistic and you're just always seeking after pleasure, then your soul becomes closer to your body. It becomes corporeal like your body is, whereas the soul is something incorporeal. And he says, so if it's just become wholly corporealized, meaning your soul is just this thing that's very earthly, then there's no hope for the soul. It just has to go to Tartarus. So that was his understanding. Whereas, if you did, for the most part, allow the rational part of the soul to exert dominance over the other two parts, it would stand in judgment and could potentially be purged. And after the purgation, it would then enter into the realm of the forms and be one with God, right? In a lot of senses, a very similar eschatology, understanding of the afterlife, to what one would consider the current Catholic Church's understanding, minus the reincarnation stuff.
But I mean, doesn't the Catholic Church have like purgatory that might be,
Right.
but like kind of a stand-in for reincarnation?
Yeah. So Plato certainly believed in purgation. He didn't believe in purgatory as a place. He believed that the flames of Tartarus are purgatory. So he believed hell and purgatory are the same thing, if you will, just that you can come out of Tartarus eventually, potentially, if you're only there for a purgative purpose.
Okay.
He thought if you were there as a condemnatory purpose, you were just going to stay there forever. So all that to say, it was possible if you ultimately allowed your rational soul to have dominance over the other two parts of the soul, but you erred at a few points in life and you maybe weren't perfect. Okay, well, you're going to spend a few years in Tartarus and then come out on the other side. And that was great.
Now can we talk about the spirit of it?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's this? Like what is the issue
with the spirited soul?
Yeah.
Well, if you ever see someone who's overly angry or overly emotional, or just they seem to not be in control of their emotions, right? That would Plato would say that you've given the spirited part of your soul dominance over the rational and appetite, which is an evil in and of itself.
So for Plato, virtue was simply reason and will.
Right, and even like denial of the other two parts of the soul. And so for him, he even locates the parts of the soul. He thinks the rational soul is located in the mind, the spirited in like the chest heart area, and the appetitive in like the gut area. And that's why it leads us to appetite and to have desires and wants and things like that. And so if you ever, Plato would be the last person to say, follow your heart. Plato would think that's horrible advice. And he thinks if you're following the other two parts of the soul, those that are mortal and irrational, the spirited and the appetitive, you're essentially becoming like the world in a sense. You're becoming like an animal. An animal operates on instinct and doesn't use reason to defer its instinct. And so Plato would liken you to an animal in that sense. And he has that in the person of Thrasymachus in the Plato's Republic. Even his name means to fight and battle, Thrasymachus.
Yeah.
So Plato didn't think very highly of the spirited part of the soul, and for him, happiness came in denying those two parts of the soul. He actually thought pleasure was an evil.
Okay.
Unlike Aristotle. But he thought pleasure was an absolute evil. To indulge in pleasure at all is evil. He was almost like a sort of proto-monastic. He thought you should only seek spiritual pleasure, and anything else was evil.
Yeah, I find this concept of we'll go back to now might be a good time to go back to idea of happiness is like the ultimate good. Because I know for me personally, I kind of bump into this idea. What was the term again? I always
eudaimonianism.
Eudaimonianism. Okay, I'll get it eventually. Fourth long.
It's like 6 syllables and stuff.
Because you see it in utilitarianism too. This idea that the maximum happiness, and I think like we're exploring Plato's idea, and you mentioned this idea of you say like spiritual, like
Plato had his spiritual elements,
like spiritual pleasure as opposed to appetite pleasure or spirited pleasure. I think maybe it's way more nuanced than maybe me or you or an average person on the street might consider happiness. And I think maybe we should go to Aristotle, because I think that's where I'm interested, is the concept of virtue and flourishing.
Yeah.
And this idea of what is flourishing, and is it really about happiness? Can you flourish without happiness?
The short answer would be no. The long answer would be Aristotle opens up his Nicomachean Ethics by answering the question, what is the motivation for all human behavior? And he says the motivation for all human behavior is happiness. Right? Anything you've ever done in your entire life was to pursue happiness. And you might object to that and say, oh, well, I mean, I went on this really hard diet and exercise regimen. I wasn't happy while doing it. It's like, yeah, but you had an end that you perceived to be happiness. So anything you've ever done in your life was in the pursuit of happiness. Even when people do harmful things, they do it perhaps for temporary happiness in exchange of overall happiness. So everyone's doing what they do in pursuit of happiness, even though what they do might not necessarily make them happy because they're confused about what will make them happy. So, yes, everything we've ever done in our lives was in pursuit of happiness, and yet we often don't do that which makes us happy.
Hmm. I think I got the concept, not the concept, but I think where I'm struggling with it is it seems like one could live a life of purpose where you're not
Mm.
necessarily happy, but you're aligned with some sort of virtue that may not provide you personal happiness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm trying to think of this. I know because on my own Buddhist practice, very much stuff is instead of an end, instead of trying to reach happiness,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of the idea of just participating in the process.
Yeah, and Aristotle would say the process is
yeah,
happiness itself. Happiness isn't this external thing that we have to get to.
yeah,
The process in and of itself, if you will, of acquiring, sustaining, and maintaining virtue is happiness. And that's why Aristotle will insist that happiness is not an action but a habit, right? We are that which we habitually do. And so virtues are also habitual, right? If I do something virtuous once in my life and never do it again, I'm not a virtuous person. I'm someone who did an act of virtue. But if I do it habitually, then I acquire that virtue. That virtue is now part of who I am.
yeah. I was reading that. It's almost similar to the Buddhist idea of practice. That
Mm-hmm.
I practice this behavior, uh, not because I want to reach a point where I'm perfect, but because it's
Mm-hmm.
just there's a difference between uh, doing something with good intentions or with right mind, right,
Right.
and doing it skillfully.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Otherwise, we might end up like the idiot from
Mm-hmm.
Dostoevsky's The Idiot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going around with great virtue and leaving a path of destruction
Right.
around us. Um, yeah, I think maybe what I'm butting up against is not the idea, the philosophical idea of happiness, but how we perceive it
Mm-hmm.
in our everyday to day life.
Sure.
So, like, even the Constitution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is a take off of John Locke, life, liberty, and the right to own property.
Yeah. Yeah.
So property gets aligned with this happiness. I don't know if it was Jefferson who wrote that, if he did that intentionally, take out the property and put in the pursuit of happiness. Uh, but I think, if we talk to the average person about obtaining happiness, they're not going to have a kind of nuanced view.
Right.
Uh, I think most of us don't necessarily have a nuanced view
Mm-hmm.
of happiness, and that's probably why I'm butting up against it because I'm trying to understand my own view of what I consider good.
Right.
Even if I don't necessarily like the idea of defining good in absolute terms,
Mm-hmm.
that's the one of the things I'm working on. Is like how do I create, like, because with Camus and being an absurdist, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems amoral, but he never got a chance to fully develop it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read his novels, it's like, okay, there seems to be a sense of morality in them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what would it be like to have a virtue system or a morality system without assigning meaning?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, oh, I'm just playing with ideas in my
No,
head.
no, no.
Maybe let's go back to Aristotle then.
No,
So,
thank you for sharing. I mean, you touched on this. In order to understand how can we be happy, you have to ask the question, what is goodness? Right? Presumably happiness when you're good. Right? I even asked that colloquially. Hey, you good?
yeah.
Right? When you're good, in a sense, you're happy. So what does it mean for something to be good, right? If morality is the pursuit of becoming a good person.
Are we talking from the point of Aristotle, or are you just posing the question?
Both.
Both.
I was going to pose the question and then point to Aristotle, but if you
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so Aristotle says that something is good insofar as it is oriented towards its telos. So in layman's terms, something's good when it does what it was designed to do. So if I have a knife and it cuts really well, I'm like, this is a good knife. And if it starts cutting poorly, I say, this is a bad knife. And if it stops cutting altogether, I say, it's no longer even a knife.
Yeah.
Right? So doing that which something is ordained to do makes something good. And so we have to ask that question now with persons, as it relates to persons. What is the telos of humanity? Right? And this is why questions about happiness and morality, I would argue, can't be answered without first answering questions about human teleology. What is our telos? What is it? What is the end of a human being? If it is reincarnation, then the end of the human being is to escape the cycle of life and death, life and death. If it is simply annihilation and we simply stop existing, then I think it becomes really hard to have a sort of a conversation about meaning and virtue and things of that nature, and I'll get back to that. But if it is to, in the traditional Platonic sense, to return to God, then the question must be asked, well, A, what is God? And B, what will make us oriented towards God? So a lot of people like to, especially in America, move from ethics to metaphysics. Like, I don't like religion A, B, or C because of the ethics I find in there. And that's a silly way of thinking, because metaphysics is not the product of ethics. Ethics is the product of metaphysics. If I were to say something silly such as, I don't agree with Islam because I love bacon, right? So I think Islam was false because I love eating bacon and Islam prohibits eating bacon. I would say, your love of bacon does not invalidate the prophet's message, right? You in no way have disproven the prophet's message simply because you love to eat bacon, right? If his message is true, you ought to cease eating bacon because that's part of his message, right? So ethics should follow from metaphysics rather than the converse. All that to say, if we're going to answer ethical questions, we have to begin with metaphysical questions. What is reality? Where are we going? Why were we created? So it's almost like as Aristotle himself would say, we're always asking whether we're moving from or towards first principles. So before we can answer the question of how can we be happy, and that's why ethics is like the last in the Aristotelian corpus, right? He has all these writings way before because he's already like concluded his philosophy, and then he moves on, well, how do we live a good life after that? All that to say, for Aristotle, who believes that there is a part of our soul, the active intellect, which is designed for immortality, and he leaves it ambiguous as to whether it is. He says every creature in the world wants to be immortal. Even plants. Plants leave seeds behind so that they can immortalize their own like DNA, if you will, in the plants that sprout from their animals, breed so that they can immortalize themselves. We live lives of virtue so that our legacies will be immortalized too. And perhaps even our souls, if the soul can survive material death. All that to say, where does happiness come from? Aristotle and Plato would tell you it comes from doing that which will bring you to a good death. That's where the term euthanasia comes from, euthanasia, good death. So, and going back to Plato one last time, everything is a preparation for death. And that's why he has the dramatic telling of Socrates' death. It's such a good death. Everyone's surrounding him and they're philosophizing. What a perfect and beautiful and grandiose death. Ethics, what something is ethical, and insofar as we are doing that which brings us towards a good death, and we acquire happiness. When we acquire the virtue which leads us to a good death. And I think that's a fair summation of Aristotelian ethics in a nutshell. And not to even mention what virtue is and how it differs from Plato. But
yeah, we hadn't even talked about like the golden mean or
right, and how it's like the medium between vice
Yeah. What is
vice
good?
and excess, and yeah.
The okay. I guess that'll get us to the philosophy of death later. So, why don't we start with Aristotle's metaphysics then?
Mhm.
Does he have a similar view to Plato, or
Yes and no. They certainly had closer views than we given before. Aristotle asks the question, "What is being?" And that's what metaphysics is. It's the question of answer. It's answering the question of what is being, and specifically, whereas everything else studies being uh, tangential, physics is the study of being in motion. Metaphysics is the study of being in and of itself, being as being.
so? Are we talking in the sense of like individual being or overall existence?
Yes.
Yes, both.
Yeah. No, everything within the realm of being and even non-being is the subject of metaphysics.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
It's interesting because like when you study Buddhism,
Mm.
I say study, I practice. I wasn't a very good student. I wasn't interested in the academics when I practiced. the it's like the idea of no self or
Yeah.
emptiness, right?
Mm.
And you run a real danger when you're dealing with these concepts of making a thing out of no self.
Mm.
You can develop an entire self around no self.
Yeah.
Uh, you can create a full something out of emptiness.
Yeah. I'm supposed to have no identity, and now my identity is trying to get rid of my identity.
Identity,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's really tricky
It is.
in that sense. So yeah, no, I would agree. Non-being is would probably fall under that category as well.
Yeah.
And Aristotle's view of that is just similar to Plato's. He doesn't have the tripartite though, does he?
He has a different tripartite. So
There's a different tripartite. Oh, that's interesting.
divided between the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. So the vegetative meaning nutrition, and so like plants, we're like plants in that respect. The sensitive in that we have five senses, seeing, smelling, what have you, and so we're like the animals in that respect. And then the thing that distinguishes us from both plants and animals is our capacity for reason. So that's Aristotle's tripartite soul, and he leaves it ambiguous as to whether the soul can survive death or not. He says the soul is destined for immortality, but the soul is bound to the body. Are you going to tell us what that means? So
No.
Yeah. So he leaves it. He leaves it intentionally ambiguous as to whether he believes the soul survives its own mortality. But for him, metaphysics is similar to Plato's. He believes what is being as being in and of itself. He believes it's ultimately God. Plato and Aristotle would both certainly identify or Aristotle would certainly identify the first principle, η πρώτη αρχή, of all existence as God. And he would argue that everything has to come from a first principle. That's what philosophy even is. It's the study of first principles. And so there must be an ultimate first principle which subsists in and of itself, which is unlike anything else, from which everything else comes. And he ultimately says that we call God. And it would, of course, be distinct, perhaps, from our understanding of God in the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic sense.
Is it distinct from the current, not the current, but his contemporary Greek idea of gods?
Yeah. Well said. So yes, because he believes the celestial spheres are gods in and of themselves, but they're not gods in the same way that the first principle is God. So it's sort of like henotheism.
Like one God to rule them
Yeah. So there's like God in and of otheos, and then there are gods created by God, which rule over the cosmic spheres. So he would not consider them to be in any way similar to God, even though he gives both the title gods. But because in ancient Greek, God sort of just means this sort of primordial force. It doesn't necessarily mean what we mean by God, which is just the big guy.
Yeah, we don't think it's not
necessarily
given the I hate to say anthropomorphized, but the idea anthropomorphized like human nature.
And for Aristotle, God was very far removed from us. God created everything and knows everything as self-subsisting thought and self-sustaining thought, God knows everything not by knowing the thing in and of itself, but by knowing himself. Since God's essence is existence in and of itself, God simply thinks about himself, and he knows everything else that there is because everything exists in God.
Is this similar, almost similar to deism?
Yeah, Aristotle could perhaps be fairly categorized as a deist.
Just in the sense that
right, I can't.
God is so ineffable that.
Yeah, in Aristotelianism, there is no praying. There is no God isn't interacting in any way, shape, or form. God is removed, and it's almost apathetic to. God is just this the primordial force to everything, and the first principle to everything. Right, and Aristotle rejects other cosmogonous explanations of existence.
Just checking time real quickly.
Yeah.
All right, we're doing fine.
Yeah. There
we got plenty of time.
Yeah, there would be no. It would be silly to tell Aristotle, oh, there was non-existence and then there was existence. Aristotle would say, okay, there needs to be a principle to that. And it would be all equally silly to say there's an infinite regress, meaning there's causation going backwards infinitely. Aristotle would say that's a literal logical fallacy that he called the fallacy.
There has to be a first cause.
Infinite regression, right? A lot of ancient Greeks believed that the earth was on a turtle. And then you would ask, well, what's that turtle on? A turtle. There are infinite turtles going on forever that are carrying everything.
That actually explains something from a YouTuber I once watched. They said it's just turtles all the way down.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's funny. They used it like as a joke.
Yeah, it used it as a joke, and then like I didn't really get the reference to turtles. Now I kind of get that.
That's funny. Yeah, and it's a fallacy because it doesn't explain anything. It actually just tries to explain one thing by saying there's an infinite there's an infinity unexplainable things, and it's like, well, that's not an explanation. Anywho, so for Aristotle, there are first principles to everything, and then there's an ultimate first principle, which he calls God, which is being in and of itself, and so for Aristotle, it would be false to say that God exists. Right? That's wrong. God does not exist.
God is existence.
Well said. Yeah, you and I exist. God does not. We exist because we participate in existence. God is existence.
Does he kind of separate us out from God's existence, or are we just kind of part of God?
Well, we are part of. That's a tough question. We're part of God's essence insofar as we are participants in God. It's like, are the fish a part of the ocean?
Okay.
Or are they separate from the ocean? And it's like they're in the ocean.
In the ocean.
Yeah. And so that would be a decent analogy for us and God. Is like everything is the ocean, and everything is in the ocean, and the ocean is.
Yeah, no, I get where you're going with this. Yeah, because if we were just part of God, then you get into the whole free will argument.
Yeah.
That we're just God pretending to be something, I guess.
Right. And Aristotle couldn't care less about like our theological problems of free will and evil, and no, it doesn't matter. It's like, there's just first principle. It's just something you deduce logically. There's no alternative explanation. But regardless, why it's important is because, well, we are then made with intention, right? So there's an intentionality to our being human, which means that there is an objectively correct way to live life, to which Aristotle posits it is the acquisition of virtue. And this is where Aristotle and Plato have the biggest difference, is in whether pleasure is a good. Because for Plato, there's an afterlife. So why would you pursue earthly pleasure when you're going to get that spiritual pleasure later in life? And for Aristotle, it doesn't seem like there's an afterlife in Aristotle. So Aristotle argues, no, pleasure in moderation is a good. Because otherwise, what's the point of life? Right? Virtue is important to keep us moderate and temperate. Right? If I'm overeating, I'll become overweight. If I'm undereating, I'll become malnutritioned, right? Proper eating is good. And pleasure, by extension, is moderation. When we do things moderately, this is pleasurable, and this is where we get happiness from. Sorry, I went on a tangent there, but...
No, I think that it actually led us back to where I was going with it. So... let's kind of return to the idea of flourishing under Aristotle. This comes out of ethics and out of virtue. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Or is it like flourishing is a good that's dried forth through ethics?
Well, I suppose in the way we're using the term flourishing, Aristotle would say we flourish when we live virtuous and ethical lives.
Okay, and we talked a little bit about it, the extremes, I guess the terms of golden mean.
Yeah.
It seems similar to me to the middle way in Buddhism.
Exactly.
It's weird. Because I always got confused when I started practicing. I'm like, right thinking, right action, right this, and it's like, okay, so tell me how to do that. And they're like, and they're like, nah, just meditate. And I was like, wait, what? What does that tell me?
And the Buddha is a great first example in that he lived a life of extreme hedonism, and then saw sickness, illness, evil. He'd been sheltered from evil his whole life, and then thought he'd go in the exact opposite direction, and perhaps became someone whom Plato would be proud of, and practiced extreme asceticism, and realized, oh, why am I literally not living, like, in a sense? Why am I'm unhappy, and so this is where he develops the middle way after, like, experimenting with extreme asceticism, which Plato would have been like, yes, continue in that. You're gonna die and you want that good spiritual pleasure in the next life. So deny yourself now so you can get that in the next life. And Buddha's like, hey, like, okay, there's evil and there's good. Why do I have to reject everything? And so he develops the middle way. It's like, okay, both are bad. Pure hedonism is bad. Pure deprivation, is bad. And so he becomes an Aristotelian. So he was lost to Plato, but Aristotle would have been happy.
There's definitely some big difference, though, between Aristotelianism and Buddhism.
Oh, certainly.
Because one of the things I'm looking at is the concepts of love and hatred, and it's like love what is good, hate, or not good, what is fine, hate what is shameful. And I'm like, it kind of gives me this, like, whereas in Buddhism it'd be like, don't hate at all. Not even the shameful. That the hatefulness itself is a problematic. And I kind of fall along those lines, that the hate itself seems to be kind of problematic. So that's kind of where I was going with wanting to talk about Aristotle, is like you got the golden mean, and what exactly is flourishing. Kind of taking us back, because I'm like we talked about earlier, is like, is it possible to flourish without being happy? I think in a way, I didn't bring the book. Bukowski has a line from one of his poems that he's like, I wouldn't call it happiness, but there was a sense of contentment, as he explains, living in the poem, living with whores, back alley fights, kind of ugliness in life. And he's like, I wouldn't call it happiness, but there's a sense of contentment. And it just seems to me, I don't know how to explain, because maybe that is kind of within view of not necessarily that you live the Bukowski lifestyle, but maybe contentment is a kind of happiness, or a nuanced version of it.
Yeah. And I guess the problem is we're all using the term happiness differently.
Yeah, we are. Yeah. It gets really hard to get everyone on the I say with any definition, right? Getting everyone on the same page.
Right. What Aristotle would say, though, is it's impossible to reject happiness. No one can say, I don't do that which makes me happy. You can say, by definition, everything you've ever done, it's like, oh, I'm laser focused on my work right now. I'm very disciplined. I'm rejecting happiness, so I can say, well, that's your version of happiness, right? You're not rejecting happiness when you say, I'm going to work 12 hours on my bodybuilding today and reject eating a donut and reject whatever. It's like, you're actually choosing happiness. It's just how you perceive happiness.
Yeah.
So for Aristotle, everyone is always doing what makes them happy.
Or what they think will make them happy.
Right. What they think, well said, what they think will make them happy. It's impossible not to choose happiness. You literally would not be able, it's a psychological theory. Every human behavior is motivated by the pursuit of happiness, right? Even whether it's, I'm going to eat 10 donuts right now, or I'm going to not eat any sugar and just work out hard in the gym. both are attempts in pursuing happiness. They're just different mindsets.
Well, it's kind of like in my case, you know, it's like getting diagnosed with a terminal illness, and you're like, okay, I'm kind of watching it with the light changing to make sure that we're getting some that we can still be seen. Um, like, what do I do with my life with the time I have? And there was an element of finding, I don't know if I want to call it passion, but doing something that was meaningful, even if it was impermanent. Like, even if I left, you're talking about legacy, right? Even my children, a little bit of a legacy, even if it's just a means of a couple of videos I can watch and be like, hey, there's dad.
Yeah.
You know, there was something my dad did. Yeah. There's maybe, you know, maybe they'll get motivated, not motivated, but, you know, I think the idea is like, because like bucket lists. I'm like, why would I do a bucket list? Like, why would I? It kind of like go live in, I won't call it hedonistic pleasure, but kind of, you know, go travel the world, go visit things, do the thing you always want to do. I always said I wanted to do, what was it called?
Bungee jumping.
No, not bungee jumping, with the parachute.
Skydiving.
No, where you jump off a bridge with a parachute, or you jump off a cliff with a parachute.
Oh, okay.
Base jumping. I wanted to do cliff base jumping.
Okay.
Incredibly dangerous because if your chute opens and you slam into the cliff, you're pretty much done.
Wow.
And I'm like, I guess I could go do that. And I'm like, nah. And ultimately, it was like I didn't see the point in just chasing that. That it was more like, let me do something that's meaningful to me, which is why I'm here.
Yeah.
Here at Marquette, right? So in a sense, Aristotle would say I'm still chasing my own happiness. I found my happiness in something more than just things that quote unquote make me feel good.
Yeah. Philosophizing, both Plato and Aristotle would say, is an essential component of happiness. And the grand story of how philosophy started, right? Thales was looking up at the stars and then fell into a ditch, and the milkmaidens were laughing at him. It's like, hey, he's happy. He's not just staying the course in the routine. He has a curiosity, and ultimately, we're all called to have an existential awareness that we neglect and just push aside. And I believe it was the Dalai Lama who famously said, we work hard, something along the lines of, we die having never lived, and we've forgotten to live along the way.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas, thank God, you're now fully committed to pursuing the good, to seeking truth.
I feel like I'm committed to committing my things to more than I can keep up with. But there's an interesting, there's a sense of feeling alive when you're struggling. When I was in Iraq, that constant sense of I'm gonna turn this way a little bit. There we go. That constant sense of being on the edge. And in a sense, you were what they call in the flow in sports. You were just in the moment, and that was all that mattered. There was a sense of, I don't want to call it meaning. There was a sense of just being. I mean, that's what meditation strives for, right? Is being in the moment, like bringing yourself away from your thoughts, be in the moment. I think that would be one of the other bigger digressions with Buddhism is that they call limits to reason. That to know more is to realize the limitations of reason. That to kind of bring your mind to awareness, which means your thoughts, like you realize if you watch, you don't really control your thoughts. But even now, like it was, I went through a really dark period in my life. and I came through it, and I was looking forward to the future. I had hope that I didn't have to rush, and then I got diagnosed, right?
Mm.
And even then, like through all the struggles of getting to the doctor, like I diagnosed with mesothelioma, going to the doctors, traveling back and forth to Boston, there was a sense of despair, but also of feeling alive.
Mm.
It was like every moment started to matter more.
Wow.
You know, if you had a good meal, it tasted that much better.
Mm.
You know, you kind of came back into the moment. I'm not sure where was I going with this.
No, I like it. Would you say that your quality of life has in a way improved since your diagnosis?
My quality of my mental life has
Mm.
improved.
Mm.
Like I spent years in meditation trying to fix myself.
Mm.
And then you kind of reached a point where it was like, wait a minute, what am I doing?
Mm.
In fact, that's what I was being taught. It's like, there's nothing to fix.
Mm.
There might be practices and things to improve, but like fixing past, it was like I was trying to fix the past.
Mm.
You know, like atone for your sins.
Mm.
And at some point, yes, I had to stop and let's start where I'm at. But a lot of my ideas kind of crystallized when I was diagnosed.
Mm.
It was like this sense of, oh, it's now or never, instead of sitting around waiting. I do like to laugh and joke that if for whatever reason I get cured or hit remission, that I'm going to be like, well, crap, now I look stupid. Right? Because I built in the whole identity around knowing I'm going to die. And I'm going to die, I don't know. It was like, I like to put it in terms of like being on death row for execution, but you're given bail.
Mm.
And that's like, you know, we'll come get you when we're ready.
Mm.
And like, when? Soon.
Right.
And so it's like you have this entirely uncertain timeline. Like, you know, it's shorter than you might have expected.
Mm.
But even that, right? I build an identity of that. What happens if the trial I'm on currently just continues to work?
Mm.
That hasn't normally been the case. Normally, after a certain amount of time, with almost all the cancer treatments for mesothelioma, after a certain amount of time, they just boom come to an end.
Mm.
So I maybe this is a good segue because we're talking a little bit about, you know, what I definitely think just kind of an end note for Aristotle is this, because flourishing was what I like. What does it really mean to flourish?
Yeah.
That happiness is a very catch-all term in the modern sense that doesn't really, I think, get at where we're going. So maybe it's time to start coming up with ideas for what that actually is. What can you say it for me again?
Eudaimonianism.
Eudaimonianism. I'll get it eventually. You know what that actually is. So since we're talking about it, let's kind of transition to philosophy of death. Because you know, I brought my own little paper, but you know, most of this is off of experience, as opposed to, you know, philosophical reflection or study of philosophers in their discussions of it. So you talked a little bit about Plato, that philosophy itself is what, preparation for death?
Preparation and the study of death.
And the study of death. But you said you had recently done classes, I think we were talking, done classes that were more modern recently, or?
With regard to?
Death, philosophy of death.
I've personally taken classes.
I thought you said that.
That
you've been in discussions.
Yeah, I've been in discussion with people who approach it from a modern philosophical perspective, sure. For one last segue back to our friends, the ancients, our friend Socrates tells us the unexamined life is not worth living. So thank you for sharing your story. Yeah. And in a sense, would you say that your diagnosis has has maybe ironically given life more meaning.
Yeah, well, if you remember, I said I was kind of an absurdist.
Yeah.
Is that I've kind of stopped assigning meanings.
Mm.
I kind of focus on like, okay, what am I doing now? How am I
Mm.
treating people now? How am I behaving now?
Mm.
How am I, like, you know, am I behaving in a way that, and that's why I'm kind of working on, can you create an absurd value moral system? Because for me, it's just kind of staying conscious, not worrying too much about God exists, God doesn't exist.
Right.
Um, in fact, in Buddhism, it's like
Irrelevant.
it's irrelevant, yeah. Um, and questions of that nature, instead of being like, what can I do now? How can I treat people now in a way that is virtuous, um, in a way that doesn't cause suffering and harm? That comes from my Zen practice, right? How do I connect with people? And one of the interesting things I found is I like one value that's arbitrary value. Treat all people with dignity and decency. Something I developed as a leader and manager in manufacturing. That regardless of what I thought about somebody or my judgments of somebody, they always deserve, or if I was, whether it was an employee, a manager, a peer, dignity and decency, always. And it might be one of those, treat people how you want to be treated, right? Um, but I just felt that, I don't want to call it human right, but that everyone deserved it, and that I started kind of withholding moral judgments of people. And what I found is that it's allowed me to have interesting conversations with people I have entirely diametrically opposed to, philosophically, politically. Uh, it's like it's like when you're honest about, okay, here's my views, here's where I come from, and here's what I believe, and I'm going to let you know I disagree with you. I might even go farther than just disagreement, right? But I still want to hear you. I want to hear what you got to say. I want to hear what you're afraid of, what you're worried about, what's behind your views. And it's really interesting because they're always tentative at first, but at some point when they realize you're not, you're not setting them up for something. Like, oh yeah, you can trust me. Like, oh my gosh, how could you? They let their guard down, and we start having real conversations where they'll even listen to me and why I have my viewpoints. And what I found is, like, politically speaking, I do consider myself very liberal. I'll have conversations with very conservative people, or at least on the surface, right? But then I find that we actually are in agreement about a lot of things. And one interesting discussion was like, yeah, I think I agree with you. There should be universal health care. I just don't trust the government to do it, right? And it was like this really funny thing. Like, we just came to total agreement about universal health care, despite the fact this person very much on the right wing. It wasn't that they were opposed to universal health care. They just didn't trust the government to do it, right? But it allowed us to have a conversation and kind of find some common grounds where there was some agreement. And I feel like going back to the hate thing, right? If you just don't have the energy to hate, it takes a lot of energy to hate, and it can just consume you. At least that's been my experience. It just consumes you.
I would agree. Yeah.
And eventually, you just kind of you get tired, and it's like I don't have time to be. I don't have the time and effort to do that, and I found, like, I read before going to Iraq, I read a book by Jonathan Shea, a psychologist who worked with soldiers from Vietnam with post-traumatic stress disorders, specifically berserkers.
Is the book called Achilles in Vietnam?
Achilles in Vietnam.
Okay, I've read.
And the idea of moral injury, it's like holding that hate was almost like you're damaging yourself.
Certainly.
But at the same time, I can have empathy for people I see who get angry or hate that they're being harmed, right? It's like you go up to a person who's experienced trauma or been abused and say, well, you really shouldn't hate them, the other person. Like, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, just entirely disenfranchising them, or that's not the right term, from their feelings.
Right.
So I found that I have my blind spots and I have my trouble spots in my personal life where old feelings, right? I've through practice I've learned to, when those happen, to sit with it and kind of let go most of the time. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask. You said you're invested in treating people well and making sure you do good and make sure you don't cause suffering and harm. Out of just curiosity for my own sake, what compels you to do that from an absurdist perspective? Because if you're an absurdist, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no reason to do anything. It's all absurd.
Yeah, you do as much as you can, right? That was Camus' thesis, right? You had what I was interested in is he gives you archetypes, right? So you have Don Juan, you have the conqueror, you have, I forget what the other one was, and then you know he talked about the creator, so creating, and he has extolled art, right? And he extolled fiction. He loved Dostoevsky, he loved Kafka. But like when I read The Fall, I started to realize that there was something a little more going on. And I think, you know, he died probably before he was able to write enough fiction that maybe someone could get an idea of what. Because when you read The Stranger, it comes off entirely amoral. It has a frightening implications for why he's convicted, but you would have a hard time having empathy for him given what he did. But I feel like there is a sense, like I watched a video essay in the plague. It's like, oh, okay, now I got to read the plague. That you kind of get stuck. That there is a sense that, and I think for me it was like realizing I went down a narcissism rabbit hole one time. So I might as well explain. I went down the narcissism rabbit hole one time, right? And I was trying to figure out why my life was the way it was. Am I a narcissist, or is my ex a narcissist? Why am I being treated the way I am? What have I done that's so terrible that I'm such a horrible person, right? And when I kind of came out of this, clawed my way out of this hole and started looking around, I started realizing it was all around me. And it was like, well, what's causing this? Why are people acting with entitlement, abusing somebody because they're entitled, right? Like you see somebody at a restaurant abusing a waitress. Like, why do they feel entitled to do that? Because they're better than the other person, right? Why? Because, well, I don't know, they have wealth, or just maybe it's what drove me personally away from Christianity as a kid. Was talk extolling virtues in the pulpit, and then seeing those same people out when I was waiting tables, just flat out being cruel to them, right? So again, I'm putting ethics before metaphysics, right?
It's not only natural. Like we're oriented to do that.
Yeah. So in a sense, I had an existential crisis. Like, how can I follow this when this is the result?
Right.
And maybe I'm just, wired that way. But when I came out, it's like I started realizing all it takes for you to justify, because usually we act and then we justify after the fact, right? We act, I would say we almost act from like because you have the whole free will argument, right? Like that we just act the way we do and we justify it later.
Mm.
From practice in Buddhism, like part of meditation is stopping yourself before you act, stepping back. They even do that with emotional intelligence when they teach it in manufacturing, right? Stop, step back, let your brain engage, and then maybe examine the situation so you can make a better informed decision. Not necessarily the best decision, but not an emotional reaction. But I started realizing that I almost, even in those situations, it's very hard to control how I react and behave unless I go back farther and set for myself some guidelines. Right. So I set some guidelines, um, not guidelines, but in a sense, like the human dignity and decency, right? That like practicing that so that when situations arise where I want to get angry or I want to or old grievances that bring a lot of feelings and hate into me, uh, that out of habit, when you're talking about habit, right? That virtue is a habit. Uh, I can behave habitually without hate, without anger. Uh, so in a sense, my agency for my actions isn't necessarily in the moment, but that's why I got interested in virtue, because I'm setting uh, kind of whether it's the golden mean or the middle way, in examination of past experiences, so I don't walk down the same street and fall in the same hole over and over again. Uh, Kind of creating behaviors of the way I would want to act in certain situations and kind of practicing those so that it's kind of a habit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So it's like realizing that my agency is not all, as I think a lot of us like to think like every time a decision comes up, we just make a decision, and that we justify the decision before we do it. But in a sense, we usually justify it after the fact.
Sure.
So going back to this idea that if I'm better than you or I'm worse than you, uh, in both cases, it kind of leads to an abusive cycle. Uh, Not even if you put yourself below somebody, not only may you allow yourself to be abused, uh, but you also might I commit idolatry, right? Like you idolize somebody, and that allows them to manipulate you to abuse others, right? Or maybe in response, you might abuse yourself because you just don't value yourself. Um, so in a sense, I kind of created an idea of a middle way, and that kind of goes back to like I was already practicing people with human dignity and decency, that I don't need meaning to tell me that the one, value myself, value others. Why? Because just from a practical level, not only will I cause harm to people, harm, the idea of moral injury, right? Harming yourself, like holding the anger, holding the hate. Uh, so so what I was doing when you're talking the archetypes, Camus says all you got to do is, I'm trying to remember in here because I actually mentioned it. He takes a very kind of Buddhist approach that you be aware. You're aware of it. You're aware of the lack of meaning. You don't have to be the conqueror or the creator. You could be, he says, a receptionist. I think he even says you could be a priest, as long as you're just aware of the lack of meaningness, that you're not signing. So in a sense, what I was doing was taking away judgment. A judgment of your inherent goodness or evil and just taking it away. It's taking away that meaning, and not judging you on those terms. Now, this is something that's hard. It's not easy. And it's not like I live up to it all the time. It's like a human being. Isn't there like a phrase about that? Like we're kind of born to judge others.
If there isn't, there should be. It's
Yeah, right.
certainly true.
That's what makes The Fall by Camus so interesting,
Mm.
because you run into Clements, and you have a discussion with Clements, and he tells you all about his life and great deeds, uh, and how he realized he was basically virtue seeking, right? He created an identity. He wasn't doing it because he actually cared about people. He was a lawyer, did all these great trials, but he did it for the adulation. Not, he made a show of being generous. And then something happens where a woman jumps off a bridge and like his whole worldview collapsed. And he started realizing like the whole like absurdity of it all, like all the stuff that he thought gave him meaning in the laugh of the woman constantly just bothering him. So he decided to become what he called a judge penitent. So he wouldn't judge people. He just made sure he would find a good, articulate person, and he would tell you his story and his judgments of himself. And he would articulate his story in a way that you would empathize with him, and by your own empathy, implicate yourself. That basically the judge penitent wasn't him judging others, but exposing his judgments of himself to everybody, so that they in turn had to reckon, or to anybody that would, a good, moral, upstanding, articulate person, right? To realize your own implicitness in this whole absurd endeavor, that your own implicitness in judgment. So instead of judging you directly, he's like, I get to judge you just by judging myself.
Really neat.
So that's why I say, like, Camus, he didn't get a chance to develop it further, right? It doesn't really strike me as entirely amoral. That there's something, he calls it absurd, but, and I don't totally go down Camus' track. I'm trying to remember, I have it here where I kind of part ways with him, because I don't imagine Sisyphus happy. But I think he's using happiness in the Aristotelian sense, I can't say it.
Yeah. Eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. So that's probably the way he's, Sisyphus who revolted against the gods. But at some point, like it was like my friend Bill, he passed away. He actually was going to give up because he had ALS. He was a Buddhist priest that I dealt a close relationship with, and his body withered away. And he had reached a point where he was allowed to die without it being a suicide. And he was still like, you know what? I'm still enjoying talking with all the people he'd mentored over the years. Right? I'm still enjoying doing it. They stuck around for about 6 or 8 more months before he finally just got too tired. So in a sense, like my whole thing just seems absurd. Like this, right? Like just struck with a terminal illness. And then like, when? I don't know. Well, screw it. I'm going to go do something with it. And I think, yeah, he said, John, I'm tired. That basically, I think I called it intimity. I heard the term intimidate, and it's like, life is full of suffering, judgment, and heartache. It's also full of joy, grace, and compassion. It's ugly, it's beautiful, it's disappointing, it's also delightful. Maybe one day God will reveal himself. Maybe it's too late. I could seek nirvana, eliminate my suffering, or choose to live life with its sorrows and disappointments. Camus and the Buddhists agree on bringing consciousness in my life. I can choose to continue to suffer, and in this way, I'm also like Sisyphus rolling my rock up the rock. Bad. I need to edit that. Rock up the hill of the drama of life. Just conscious of the limits limit of my understanding,
Mm.
right? So I'm not trying to, there, like my sense of innocence and acknowledgement of my guilt. I'm both innocent and guilty. Have the possibility for both good and evil, for greatness and obscurity. Just, live it. Why not? And acknowledge it's not always going to be pleasant, right? So maybe I strive for happiness, but I accept that living life itself, because I feel like even Buddhism is kind of an escape, right?
Mm.
Like get off the cycle of birth and death, or death and rebirth, right? It's like in Mahayana, you have the Bodhisattva who keeps coming back to help alleviate other suffering.
Mm.
But maybe part of the point of living life is with the suffering. It's not that suffering itself is good,
Mm.
but it's part of it, right?
Yeah.
I think where I ended up is I just don't hold too much attachment to things,
Mm.
right? Because so much of suffering's with attachment. So I'm attached to my children, but I'm not attached that they be a certain way. I'm not attached. Like I would be devastated if one of them like was in a car accident and died. I'd be absolutely like it probably. I don't know if I could survive the right. If somebody did something horrible to them, I would find it very hard not to be angry. Uh, but I think these things come up, and I think it's important. Like because when in Myth Sisyphus, he isn't so much concerned about morality; he's concerned about do I commit suicide or don't I?
Mm.
Right?
Mm.
Live it.
Yeah.
Move past your desperation for meaning.
Mm.
And I take that in a sense of absolute meaning.
Yeah.
Just move past it and move forward. Let go of it. Let go of your desire for meaning. And just continue to live it as much as you can.
Mm.
Uh, so that's kind of where I go with that.
Mm.
Is there any like counterpoints or other views on death from conversations you've had? Like in a modern sense?
Oh, in a modern sense?
Or maybe conversations
Yeah.
that you've had with others, not necessarily modern.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? The moderns seem to talk less about death than the ancients do.
Really?
In my experience, whether it's Kant, Hume, Locke, whoever it may be, and even the postmoderns.
I think I kind of agree with you because it's an interesting experience. People are not comfortable with death.
Yeah,
They're very uncomfortable with death.
certainly.
People will be like, "Hey, man, you got such a positive attitude. Like it's great to see you have such a positive attitude in the face of this." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's because I gave up hope." And they're like, "Wait, what?
Mm.
But don't you need hope?" Like, no, hope's a killer.
Yeah.
Right? Because what happens when you hope?
Right.
And you don't get like
right.
hope against hopes, right?
Right.
And things just keep going wrong. What then? What do you do then?
Yeah.
Instead of just, I think Dr. Tucker was saying like, oh, radical acceptance.
Mm.
So it's kind of a radical acceptance.
Mm.
It's going to be what it's going to be.
Right.
I'm just going to live it as much as I can.
Even it's a very stoic approach, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there is some stoicism. There's definitely, I studied the Stoics for a little bit. I probably studied them more than I did the Buddhism I was practicing. Yeah, there's definitely an element of that. And that's why I say when there's like Camus says you can be an absurdist without necessarily falling in his categories. I don't think it's necessarily I don't think an absurdist is necessarily moral, but I think there's a case to be made for a moral absurdist. That as a path to follow.
Oh, really interesting.
And I that's but when it comes to death, yeah, it's going to be what it's going to be. Like almost the worst scenario now, because we've talked about we're doing our seminar on applied philosophy, right, which is basically a career preparation course. And I'm like, I'm not sure I needed to take this class. Uh, because probably one of the worst things that would happen for me now would be to get through it all and be like, oh, like I lived long enough to get a PhD. What do I do with this now? I don't even know if I want to be an academic. Maybe I'll just be a bartender and make YouTube videos. Well, you got to find a way to stay connected to the community, right, in order to do that. Um, so yeah, because now I built an identity around what's going to happen. Uh, but when I say I'm confident that I know what's going to happen, is because I was already pretty close. I was stage 3. Uh, I was stage 3. Well, the doctor says it's hard to stage mesothelioma, but the only thing is it hadn't escaped my chest. Uh, so I got a bit of a reset through treatments, chemotherapy, surgery, immunotherapy that kind of reduced the amount by a significant amount. So I regained a large quality of life. And honestly, learning that I was going to live longer at certain points was really hard to deal with because there's a comfort in the certainty, certainty of death. And then it's like, oh, well, that ground gets taken out from you too. Now you got to live longer, and what are you going to do with that? Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of my favorite, I might include, I'll add it to the video here, and I'm going to butcher it entirely too, I'm pretty sure. It is a quote from the recent show. Like I was really amazed. I'm watching an animated show called Arcane, and the villain of all people has this dialogue at the start of an episode. He's like, ever wonder what it's like to drown? There's a peace in water, like it's calling you. Just open it up, let it in. All your problems will fade away. But then there's this thing, and of course in the show he's, it's showing somebody drowning him, and he's fighting. He's like, there's this madness, this fight to survive. You know what? Let me just kind of, I can always edit this. So I'll just put brilliance. Yeah, so there it is. Ever wonder what it's like to drown? Story of opposites. There's peace in water, like it's holding you, whispering in low tones to let it in. And every problem in the world will fade away. But then there's this thing in your head, and it's raging, lighting every nerve with madness to fight, to survive. And all the while, the question lingers before you. Have you had enough? It's funny, you could pass a lifetime without ever facing a choice like that, but it changes you forever. For that, I thank you, old friend.
Whoa, geez.
Yeah, it's like, this is so I'm watching this, I'm like, given my own experience, what I'm facing, I'm like, that's what it kind of felt like when I was diagnosed, that I was drowning. And that, like, there was this temptation just to give up and let it happen. Just let all my problems fade away. Yeah, so, but, but then there's this madness.
Do you think more people should sort of wrestle with this the way that you are? Because
I've had
at the end of the day, we're all mortal.
Yeah.
Something we're all going to face.
I think it's interesting that you talk about, the older philosophers talk about death more often, in that we kind of avoid it.
Yeah.
Right? We avoid talking about death. And I think it's definitely something worth, not even just philosophically, but maybe psychologically, having frank conversations about.
Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard for me to recommend my path to somebody. Because what led me to the point where I was able to face my own death was like almost a decade of walking tightrope of madness. Because I faced death multiple times, right? I faced it in Iraq. I also learned that nostalgia is PTSD. I never thought of that before. Because I'm like, oh, I don't have PTSD. I don't have any bad effects from my combat experience. But then I keep being nostalgic for, walking the streets of Mosul and being in that situation where it's dangerous. And it took me a while to realize that that's PTSD. And for a period, I was suicidal. Like, I got the American dream. I went after it, I got it, and I was miserable. And was riding the edge for a long time. I did have go to therapy. I just didn't start meditation practice. I went to therapy, but I kept trying to fix it, right? And that was a hard path to walk because I feel like the emotions were so strong that if I recommended to somebody, I might be signing their death warrant, especially somebody who's suicidal, because it was a hard path to walk. So I think maybe as a culture, maybe it is discussions worth having as a culture, philosophically, psychologically, having these discussions about what it means to be mortal. Because obviously, like you said, like Aristotle and Plato, like it's pretty, I think you end up in existentialism, and it's like, well, what are you afraid of? Like, right? What are you afraid of existentially?
Yeah.
You're kind of afraid of death. That's why I think why Camus brings it down to the question: if life has no meaning, why bother? Is suicide, if life has no meaning, is suicide the answer? And he uses references to Dostoevsky's stories. I can't remember the name of the characters who glorify suicide, right? Because life has no meaning. But I think that's what we're afraid of. And even if we're afraid of morality, right? We're afraid of what it means for our death. So, in a sense, I like to say, there's a YouTuber out there. His YouTube's called Unsolicited. I don't know if he ever says his name. It's called Unsolicited Advice. He does a lot of essays, but he calls himself a agnostic atheist. And I never thought of it in terms like that. It's like I wouldn't really consider myself an atheist. Like more of a agnostic, probably theist in the sense of like the way Plato and Aristotle talk about God, just existence and being, more deistic view of God. But I don't hold tightly to those ideas, which is why I don't give them identity in a sense, which is why I'd say I'm agnostic. But I definitely wouldn't say I'm like an atheist. Hoping this is continuing to watching the things. Like, are we speaking loud enough? Hopefully people can hear it. But this is a learning experience. So if I end up having to, next time I do a video, I'll make sure to maybe raise the gain volume there. I've played around with stuff before, and like you finish a video and start realizing, man, no one can barely hear me. And there's probably things I can do in Blender to adjust the volume of the sound.
You're better than me. I have like zero experience with anything.
Well, that's the whole funny thing about the whole thing, right? Is that I'm taking experience from doing a hobby. I mean, like, well, why don't I do that here? So I'm not starting from scratch, right? Really. It was something I learned to do just for my online racing hobby. That was my dream as a kid. I was going to be a race car driver.
Oh, I see.
That is very much a rich man's sport. So I got to live it out a bit on the computer.
Oh, that's really cool, though.
Yeah. What are some of we talked a little bit about Plato or any other kind of ancient or philosophers and what they talk about with death? I know like Marcus Aurelius talks about that. I'm trying to remember what he said though. Can't skipping off on.
I'm not very well read in my Marcus Aurelius. But since we have a few minutes left, I guess we can ask the last question: Is death evil?
I don't think so. Not me. What do you think about it?
Plato and Aristotle had fundamentally different ideas. Aristotle called it the ultimate evil. Plato called it the ultimate good.
I think I kind of go back to my not assigning evil or goodness to it. It's just kind of is.
Yeah.
I like to anthropomorphize death all the time. It's like, hey, tapped on my shoulder and said, hey, I'm here for you, but you know what? I'm going on vacation. I'll be back in a bit.
Right.
Right? But that it's just kind of a joke. It's not really in a sense of that death has any sort of, yeah, I really just don't give it, I don't give it goodness either, or evil. It's just kind of part of life.
Mm.
I think, in fact, I think that's what I said here, is that death is life, life is death. I don't remember where it's at. I should have underlined it. I read my own paper before I come to this discussion, which of course I didn't do. But yeah, I think to me, the two are kind of intertwined.
Mm.
I don't know about death and rebirth. I don't know about heaven and hell. My mom's very concerned.
Very
She's
sad.
very, very, very stout evangelical Christian.
Mm.
So she's very concerned. It's kind of heartbreaking for me because I feel like when I pass, that she's gonna be heartbroken that I went to hell.
Mm.
Uh, I don't know. There's so much metaphor in the body in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
So when I talk about good and evil, uh, good and bad, good and evil, I like to use the metaphor of the apple, the knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? I find that such a beautiful metaphor because it's like the problem wasn't knowledge.
Yeah.
It was knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of judgment. That, and I tie that back to my own theory, right? Judgment that I'm better than you, or I'm worse than you, or that itself. And that's probably maybe not how it was meant, but that's what I kind of took from the metaphor.
Say the last part one more time, and like, we acquire judgment through knowledge of evil. Was that?
Yeah, right. So knowledge of good and evil gives us the ability to judge. To judge things as good. Judge them as evil.
Whereas if we had no evil, we wouldn't be able to categorize it as such.
Yeah,
so
maybe.
Wouldn't be able to judge. Is that?
Yeah, just a sense that knowledge itself isn't the problem. It was a knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. So I'm tying that to the judgment of a person's inherent goodness or badness. Right. So if I look at it from the perspective of death, is death good or is it evil? It just is.
Yeah.
It's you can't escape it. Death and taxes.
Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing so much of your own personal background.
And what's your view on it?
I am inclined to agree with both Plato and Aristotle in a sense.
It's
both the ultimate good and the ultimate evil. Where I'm breaking I'm escaping from ancient Greek philosophy and just talking about my own personal religious perspectives. As an Orthodox Christian, God tells Adam and Eve in Genesis, if you eat from the tree, you shall die by death. Which is bizarre. What else are you going to die by? You're going to die by death. But it seems to be that there's two meanings to death that are used equivocally. Right? You will die by death. All of us understand death to mean the separation of the soul from the body, or by soul, you don't have to believe in like a spiritual soul, like just the principle of life from the body.
Yeah.
Right? The body no longer is conscious. And there seems to be a second definition of death, which is the separation of the soul from God. Right? So your soul will leave the body because the soul has left God. And even on Easter, we all chant this hymn, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling death by death. So again, this double usage of death. He has destroyed the separation of the soul from the body by destroying the separation of the soul from God. So this is why I'm inclined to agree with both Plato and Aristotle in that death is the ultimate evil, as Aristotle says. It's foreign in the Christian perspective. It was not part of God's design. It is a consequence of separating from God that corruption enters into the world. But that, like, as Plato would tell us, it is also the ultimate good because it allows us to return to God, which was not the case prior to the resurrection within the Christian paradigm. All that to say, yes to both of them. I see where Aristotle is coming from. I see where Plato is coming from. And in a certain sense, I agree with both of them, depending on paradigm.
Yeah.
And then the reason why Aristotle considered it the ultimate evil is because he thought existence was goodness itself, right? Something is good insofar as it is, and vice versa. So health is good, is a good, whereas sickness is the absence of health. And he thought all evil was just privation, meaning it was just the absence of something. So light exists, so it must be good. Darkness is just the absence of light, so it's evil in that respect. And so he thought death was the absence of life, and life is the means by which we experience every other good. So logically, it follows that death is the ultimate evil, especially for him, where it doesn't seem like he holds to an afterlife. It makes sense why he would hold that is the ultimate evil if existence is.
Well, non-existence is a terrifying concept.
Yeah.
It really is. The eternal slumber.
Yeah.
It's almost an incomprehensible idea. It's like trying to comprehend infinity.
Yeah.
Trying to comprehend God.
Yeah.
Trying to comprehend non-God.
Yeah.
Right? It just almost doesn't even pay. It's like nothing is something as soon as you talk about nothing.
Yeah.
So comprehending nothingness or emptiness it's almost incomprehensible, and I think death is kind of similar.
Yeah.
It's incomprehensible what happens afterwards.
Yeah.
So I just kind of stopped worrying about it.
I'm glad you're not in a place of worrying anymore. I'm glad you're in a more peaceful place, and you're in a place in life where you're examining life, which
it's examining life and how I live life and how I interact with people, and how do I, help others not suffer but enjoy life around me. And I'm not perfect. I like to put my foot in my mouth a lot. Yeah.
Likewise.
All right.
Likewise.
I think we reached a pretty good ending point.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much.
Hopefully
I enjoyed this. Thank you so much. I enjoyed getting to know you too. So
absolutely, yeah, and kind of getting to know your background, and you brought a lot of knowledge that made it easy to understand. I think that's kind of the goal of this channel. That's why I said dress casual.
Yeah.
We're not here to be ultimate philosophers. We're just to have the conversations, and I would like to do some roundtables, and maybe if we get enough of an audience, I'm not sure I'll ever get enough of an audience to do it's like live streams. I thought that would be pretty cool.
That's really cool.
So we'll see where this goes.
I'm happy to watch and attend. So please keep me updated.
Will do. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, John.
Appreciate it a lot.